The summer of 1962 brought an unusual guest to Windsor Castle. Senator Robert Mitchell from Texas had arrived in London as part of a congressional delegation studying NATO defense strategies. But his reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. Known throughout Washington, D.C. for his sharp tongue, confrontational style, and complete disdain for what he called foreign pageantry, Mitchell had already made headlines during his brief stay in Britain. At 63 years old, Senator Mitchell had built his political career on challenging authority and questioning traditions that he considered wasteful or outdated. He had served in World War II as a tank commander, earning several medals for bravery, but had returned home with a deep skepticism about military ceremony that wasn't directly related to combat effectiveness. The castle staff had been warned about their distinguished visitor's difficult personality. Head butler, James Wilson, briefed his team extensively about the senator's previous complaints regarding what he termed unnecessary formalities at the American embassy. Wilson emphasized the importance of maintaining perfect service standards. Despite any provocative behavior from their guest, Corporal David Thompson, 24 years old and recently assigned to the prestigious Windsor Guard, was selected for special duty during the senator's visit. Thompson had earned his position through exceptional performance and unwavering dedication to the ancient traditions of the UHN royal household. His military bearing and calm demeanor had impressed his superiors, making him an ideal choice for potentially challenging ceremonial duties. The senator's first day at the castle had proceeded smoothly enough, with formal meetings about defense cooperation and guided tours of the historic buildings. However, those who knew Mitchell well recognized the signs of growing irritation in his body language and increasingly sarcastic comments about the elaborate theatrical productions he observed throughout the day. "Tell me again why grown men need to dress up like toy soldiers and march around in perfect squares?" Mitchell had asked his aide during lunch, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room. Several British officials exchanged uncomfortable glances, but maintained their diplomatic composure. That afternoon, while being escorted through the castle's staterooms, Senator Mitchell encountered Corporal Thompson standing guard outside the Queen's private apartments. The young guard stood perfectly still in his scarlet uniform, his bearskin hat adding impressive height to his already commanding presence. His rifle held with practiced precision, Mitchell stopped abruptly and stared at the motionless figure, with undisguised curiosity mixed with contempt. "How long does he stand there like that?" he asked his British escort, Lord Pemberton, in a voice loud enough for Thompson to hear clearly. "The guards maintain their posts for 2-hour shifts, Senator," Lord Pemberton replied diplomatically. "It's a tradition that dates back centuries and represents the unwavering dedication of Her Majesty's forces to protecting the royal family." 2 hours of standing perfectly still, accomplishing absolutely nothing useful, Mitchell muttered, walking closer to examine Thompson as if he were studying an interesting museum exhibit. "In Texas, we'd call this a waste of good manpower." Corporal Thompson had been trained to ignore comments from visitors, but something about the senator's tone suggested that this encounter might become more challenging than the usual tourist curiosity. His years of service had taught him to remain focused on his duty regardless of external distractions. Yet he sensed that his training was about to be tested in unexpected ways. The senator circled around Thompson slowly, examining his uniform, his posture, and his equipment with the critical eye of someone looking for flaws or weaknesses. "Does he ever move? Blink. Show any sign that there's actually a human being inside that costume." Lord Pemberton was becoming visibly uncomfortable with the senator's behavior, but was constrained by diplomatic protocol from directly challenging a visiting dignitary. "Senator Mitchell, our guards are highly trained professional soldiers who take their ceremonial duties very seriously." "Professional soldiers," Mitchell repeated with obvious skepticism. "In my experience, professional soldiers are busy learning tactics, maintaining equipment, and preparing for real combat situations. They don't spend their time playing dress-up games for tourists." The group of American and British officials accompanying the senator began to sense that the situation was developing beyond normal diplomatic courtesy. Several aides exchanged worried glances, uncertain about how to redirect their volatile guest's attention away from the stoic guard. Mitchell seemed to interpret their discomfort as confirmation of his point about the absurdity of British military traditions. "You know what I think?" he announced to the assembled group. "I think this whole performance is designed to impress people who don't understand real military discipline. It's theater, not soldiering." Corporal Thompson continued to stare straight ahead, but those observing closely could see the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he was listening to every word. His training had prepared him for many types of challenges, from weather extremes to security threats. But dealing with a prominent foreign official who seemed determined to mock his service was uncharted territory. The senator's aide, knowing his employer's tendency to escalate confrontations, attempted to guide him away from the guard post. "Senator, perhaps we should continue with the scheduled tour. The defense minister is expecting us in 20 minutes. But Mitchell had clearly decided that this encounter represented something larger than mere curiosity about British customs. He saw an opportunity to challenge what he viewed as outdated military traditions that served no practical purpose in the modern world. "Actually," Mitchell said with the tone of someone who had just made an important decision, "I think I'd like to spend a little more time observing this fascinating display of British military excellence. Cancel my next appointment." Lord Pemberton felt a growing sense of dread as he realized that the controversial American senator was preparing to turn a routine diplomatic visit into some kind of confrontation with one of Her Majesty's guards. The afternoon that had started as a standard ceremonial obligation was about to become something unprecedented in the history of Anglo-American diplomatic relations. Senator Mitchell's decision to focus his attention on Corporal Thompson transformed the routine diplomatic visit into a tense confrontation that would test the limits of military protocol and international diplomacy. The senator positioned himself directly in front of the guard, close enough that normal conversation would require some acknowledgement or response. "Son," Mitchell began, his Texas drawl deliberately slow and patronizing. "I served in the Second World War. I've seen real soldiers in real combat situations. What exactly are you accomplishing standing here like a department store mannequin?" Thompson's training had covered various scenarios involving difficult visitors, but none had prepared him for a direct challenge from a high-ranking American official who seemed determined to provoke a reaction.
"Oh."
The corporal maintained his rigid posture and forward gaze, treating the senator's words as background noise to be ignored. Mitchell interpreted the guard's silence as either stubbornness or simple inability to think independently. "Are you even allowed to think for yourself? Or do they just wind you up in the morning and let you run down at night?" Lord Pemberton stepped forward with obvious discomfort. "Senator Mitchell, I must point out that Corporal Thompson is following established protocol. Guards on ceremonial duty do not engage in conversation with visitors." "Protocol," Mitchell repeated with disgust. There's that word again. "It's protocol that serves no purpose except to make people feel important about meaningless activities." Senator began walking back and forth in front of Thompson, his movements becoming more animated as his rhetoric intensified. "You know what we call this in America? We call it make work. Busy work designed to keep people occupied when there's nothing useful for them to do." Several members of the American delegation were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with their colleagues' behavior, but Mitchell held sufficient seniority and influence that none felt able to directly challenge him. They exchanged worried glances and tried to signal their disapproval through body language, but the senator was too focused on his confrontation to notice.
"All right."
And more aggressive. "This represents a country that's more concerned with preserving outdated traditions than adapting to modern military realities. No wonder the British Empire collapsed. This direct attack on British military competence and national pride crossed a line that made even the most diplomatic observers wince." Lord Pemberton's face reddened with suppressed anger, but his position required him to maintain composure regardless of the provocation. "Corporal," Thompson felt the weight of representing not just his unit or his service, but his entire nation's military reputation in the face of this unprecedented attack. Every instinct told him to respond to the senator's insults, to defend his service and his country's honor. Yet his duty required absolute silence and immobility. Mitchell seemed to sense that he was having an impact, even though Thompson showed no visible reaction. "I've been watching you for 10 minutes now, and you haven't moved a muscle. That's not discipline, son. That's conditioning. We've turned you into a robot." The senator's aide made another attempt to redirect his employer's attention. "Senator, perhaps we should discuss these observations privately rather than privately," Mitchell interrupted sharply. "Why should we discuss this privately? Making valid points about military efficiency and resource allocation. These people need to hear some honest criticism about their wasteful practices." The confrontation was beginning to attract attention from other parts of the castle. Staff members found excuses to pass by the area, curious about the unusual scene of an American senator berating a British guard. Word began spreading through the castle's communication networks that something extraordinary was happening. Mitchell decided to escalate his challenge to a more personal level. "Tell me something, son. When you joined the army, did you dream about standing motionless in a fancy uniform, or did you want to be a real soldier?" The question struck at the heart of Thompson's motivations for military service. Like most guards, he had indeed joined with dreams of meaningful service and potential combat duty. The ceremonial assignment, while prestigious, was not his ultimate career goal. "'Cause let me tell you what real soldiers do," Mitchell continued relentlessly. "Real soldiers learn skills that keep people alive. They train with modern weapons and tactics. They don't waste time learning how to stand still and look pretty for tourists." Thompson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that the senator's words were affecting him. His service record included extensive training in combat skills, tactical operations, and modern military technology. But his current duty required him to appear as nothing more than a decorative figure. Lord Pemberton made one more attempt to defuse the situation. "Senator, I believe Corporal Thompson's training record would impress you if you were to review it. Our ceremonial guards are selected from among our most capable soldiers." "Then why waste capable soldiers on ceremonial nonsense?" Mitchell shot back immediately. "If he's truly capable, he should be doing something that actually contributes to national defense." The senator's logic was not entirely without merit, which made his attack more difficult to counter. Many military professionals had indeed questioned the resource allocation involved in ceremonial duties, though few would express such views so publicly or aggressively. Mitchell stepped closer to Thompson, close enough that his breath was visible. On the guard's polished buttons, "I'll tell you what, son. I'm going to stand here and continue this conversation until you either respond like a human being or prove that you're nothing more than a well-dressed statue." With this declaration, the senator made clear that he intended to transform their encounter into a prolonged test of wills. The diplomatic visit had become a personal challenge that would test Thompson's discipline. Mitchell's persistence and the patience of everyone forced to witness their unprecedented confrontation. Senator Mitchell's declaration that he would continue his confrontation until Thompson responded marked a dangerous escalation in what had begun as diplomatic curiosity. The senator settled into a position where he could maintain his verbal assault, while appearing to conduct a legitimate examination of British military customs. "You know what I think happened to you, son?" Mitchell began, his tone becoming more psychologically probing. "I think you were probably a decent soldier once, maybe even a good one. But somewhere along the way you let them convince you that standing perfectly still was more important than thinking for yourself." The senator's strategy was becoming clear to the uncomfortable observers. He was attempting to provoke Thompson by attacking not just his current duty, but his personal character and decision-making ability. This approach went far beyond criticism of military traditions into territory that felt deeply personal and insulting. "I bet you tell yourself this assignment is an honor," Mitchell continued relentlessly. "I bet your family back home thinks you're doing something important, protecting the Queen and representing British military excellence. But what are you really doing? You're a tourist attraction, son. Nothing more." Thompson's breathing remained controlled and steady, but the psychological pressure was beginning to accumulate. The senator's words were designed to undermine his sense of purpose and professional pride, attacking the very foundations of his commitment to military service. Lord Pemberton attempted once more to intervene diplomatically. Senator Mitchell, I must protest this line of questioning. Corporal Thompson is performing his assigned duties with distinction, and your characterization of his service is both inaccurate and inappropriate. Inappropriate? Mitchell wheeled around to face Lord Pemberton with obvious anger. What's inappropriate? Is wasting trained soldiers on ceremonial pageants while real military challenges go unaddressed? This man could be contributing to actual defense capabilities instead of playing dress-up for foreign visitors. The senator's criticism was gaining an audience as more castle staff and officials found reasons to observe the unprecedented confrontation. Some watched with concern for Thompson's well-being under such sustained verbal attack, while others were fascinated by the clash between American directness and British ceremonial tradition. Mitchell returned his attention to Thompson with renewed intensity. Let me ask you something personal, soldier. Do you have a wife? Children? People who depend on you to be more than a living statue? This invasion into Thompson's personal life crossed another line that made even Mitchell's own delegation uncomfortable. Several American officials began whispering among themselves about the appropriateness of their colleagues' behavior and its potential impact on diplomatic relations. Because if you do have family, Mitchell pressed on, what do you tell them? About your service? You tell them you spent your day protecting the realm by standing motionless in a hallway? Do you tell them you're serving your country by refusing to acknowledge when someone speaks directly to you? Thompson's personal life was indeed a source of motivation for his military service. He was engaged to marry his longtime girlfriend, Sarah, next spring, and his assignment to the prestigious Windsor Guard was something he had worked years to achieve. The senator's mockery of his service felt like an attack on everything he had. Sacrifice, 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 sacrifices. The psychological pressure was compounded by Thompson's awareness that his response to this challenge would reflect on his entire unit and potentially on British military reputation more broadly. Every guard who had ever stood ceremonial duty was being judged through his ability to maintain composure under unprecedented provocation. You want to know what I really think? Mitchell announced to the growing crowd of observers. I think this young man is trapped in a system that values appearance over substance, tradition over effectiveness, and blind obedience over intelligent service. The senator's critique was beginning to sound less like diplomatic observation and more like a philosophical attack on the entire concept of ceremonial military duty. His words carried weight because they came from someone with legitimate combat experience and political authority. Mitchell moved to stand directly beside Thompson, speaking quietly enough that only the guard could hear clearly. Son, I know you can hear me, even if you can't respond. I want you to think about something. Is this really how you want to spend your military career? Is this really serving your country? The private nature of these comments made them somehow more penetrating than the public declarations. Thompson found himself genuinely considering the senator's questions about the value and purpose of his service, even as he maintained his disciplined silence. I've seen what happens to soldiers who spend too much time on ceremonial duty, Mitchell continued in the same quiet tone. They lose their edge, their initiative, their ability to think independently. They become so focused on following precise rules that they forget how to adapt to unexpected situations. The irony was that Thompson was currently demonstrating exactly the kind of adaptability and mental strength that Mitchell claimed ceremonial duty destroyed. His ability to maintain composure while processing complex psychological pressure showed remarkable resilience and professional competence. As the confrontation entered its second hour, it became clear that both men were committed to seeing their test of wills through to some kind of resolution. Mitchell seemed determined to prove his point about the futility of ceremonial duty, while Thompson was equally committed to upholding the standards and traditions of his service. The growing crowd of observers began to realize they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed long after the senator's visit ended. The confrontation had evolved beyond a simple diplomatic incident into a profound examination of different philosophies about military service, duty, and the relationship between tradition and effectiveness. As the confrontation stretched into its third hour, Senator Mitchell's persistence was becoming legendary among the castle's staff and visiting officials. Word had spread throughout Windsor Castle that an American politician was engaged in an unprecedented Test a will with one of Her Majesty's guards, drawing curious observers from every department. The senator had exhausted his initial arsenal of criticism and mockery, but showed no signs of abandoning his challenge. His approach evolved to become more methodical and psychologically sophisticated, as if he were conducting an extended interrogation designed to break down Thompson's resolve. "You know what really bothers me about this whole performance?" Announced loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "It's the waste of human potential. Here's a young man who could be learning valuable skills, developing leadership abilities, contributing to real military objectives. Instead, he's been turned into a living museum piece." Captain William Sterling, Thompson's commanding officer, had arrived to assess the situation after receiving reports about the unusual incident. Sterling found himself in an impossible position. His duty was to protect his subordinate from unreasonable harassment, but diplomatic protocol prevented him from directly confronting a visiting American senator. Mitchell noticed the arrival of the British officer and seized the opportunity to expand his critique. "Captain, is it perfect timing? Perhaps you can explain to me the military value of training soldiers to stand motionless for hours at a time. What combat situations does this prepare them for?" Captain Sterling responded with careful diplomacy. "Senator Mitchell, our ceremonial duties require exceptional discipline, mental focus, and physical endurance. These qualities translate directly to effectiveness in all military operations." "Mental focus?" Mitchell laughed sarcastically.
What?
"Mental focus is required to stare at a wall for 3 hours. What military operation benefits from soldiers who are conditioned to ignore direct communications from senior officials?" The senator's logic was becoming more sophisticated and harder to counter. He was systematically deconstructing the rationale for ceremonial guard duty, using arguments that had some merit, even if his methods were inappropriate. Thompson, meanwhile, was experiencing the most challenging test of his military career. The physical demands of maintaining perfect posture for extended periods were significant, but the psychological pressure of sustained personal attack was far more difficult to endure. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the cool. Castleair. Mitchell seemed to sense that he was finally having a visible impact on the stoic guard. "There we go," he said with satisfaction, noting the perspiration. "Finally, some sign that there's a human being inside that fancy uniform." The senator's observation of Thompson's physical response drew uncomfortable laughter from some observers, though others were beginning to view Mitchell's behavior as cruel rather than merely challenging. The line between legitimate criticism and personal harassment was becoming increasingly blurred. "Let me try a different approach," Mitchell announced, changing his strategy once again. "Soldier, I'm going to tell you a story about real military service. I want you to consider the contrast with your current situation." The senator began recounting his experiences during World War II, describing a tank battle in France where quick thinking and independent action had saved his crew from destruction. His narrative was compelling and clearly based on genuine combat experience, making his criticism of ceremonial duty more credible and harder to dismiss. In that situation, Mitchell concluded, success depended on soldiers who could think, adapt, and make split-second decisions under pressure. Soldiers who had been trained to stand perfectly still, regardless of circumstances, would have gotten everyone killed. Thompson found the senator's war story genuinely interesting and could appreciate the courage and leadership it represented. However, he also recognized that different military situations required different skills, that ceremonial duties served purposes beyond simple tradition. The crowd of observers had grown to include several members of the American delegation, who were becoming increasingly concerned about their colleagues' behavior. Senator Patricia Williams from California approached Mitchell's aide with obvious worry. "This has gone far enough," Senator Williams whispered urgently. "Bob's making us all look bad, and he's putting that poor guard through unnecessary torture. Someone needs to intervene before this becomes an international incident." Mitchell's aide nodded in agreement, but knew from long experience that the senator was virtually impossible to redirect once he had committed to a course of action. "Senator, Mitchell doesn't abandon challenges easily. He'll keep this up until he gets some kind of response or proves his point." Meanwhile, Mitchell was preparing for what appeared to be his final escalation. "Soldier, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to demonstrate that you're more than a well-trained robot. I'm going to ask you a direct question that any thinking person should be able to answer." The senator positioned himself directly in front of Thompson, close enough that their faces were only inches apart. The intensity of the moment was palpable, and the assembled observers fell silent in anticipation of what would happen next. "Here's my question, son," Mitchell said in a voice that carried clearly throughout the corridor. "Are you proud of what you're doing right now? You proud to represent your country by standing like a statue while a foreign visitor criticizes everything you believe in?" The question struck at the core of Thompson's motivation for military service and his sense of personal dignity. It demanded not just professional composure, but a fundamental examination of whether his current duty was truly honorable or merely an exercise in elaborate submission. As the question hung in the air between them, everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define both men's reputations and potentially influence diplomatic relations between their nations. Thompson's response, or lack thereof, would either validate Mitchell's criticism or demonstrate a form of courage that transcended the senator's narrow definition of military effectiveness. The silence that followed Senator Mitchell's final challenge seemed to stretch endlessly through the ornate corridor. Every person present held their breath, waiting to see whether Corporal Thompson would break his disciplined silence or maintain his post. Despite the unprecedented psychological pressure he had endured for over 3 hours, Mitchell stood inches from Thompson's face, his eyes searching for any sign of weakness, doubt, or capitulation. The senator's expression showed both determination and a hint of uncertainty, as if he was beginning to realize that his challenge had evolved into something far more significant than he had initially intended. Thompson, for his part, was experiencing a moment of profound clarity. The senator's final question about pride had forced him to examine not just his immediate duty, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. In that crystalline moment, he found his answer. Without breaking his military bearing, without abandoning his post, and without violating any aspect of his ceremonial duty, Thompson did something that shocked everyone present. A single tear rolled down his cheek, not from weakness or defeat, but from an overwhelming surge of pride in his service and his country. The tear was visible to everyone watching, but its meaning was unmistakable. It was not the tear of a broken man or a defeated soldier, but the emotional response of someone who had found unshakable conviction in the face of sustained attack. Thompson had discovered that his pride in his duty was so deep that it could not be hidden. Even under the strictest military discipline, Mitchell stepped back as if struck, his aggressive posture immediately dissolving. In all his years of political combat and military service, he had never encountered such a profound demonstration of quiet dignity and unshakable conviction. The tears spoke louder than any words Thompson could have used to defend his service. "My God," whispered Senator Williams, who had been watching with growing concern, "he's not broken at all. He's magnificent." The crowd of observers began to understand what they had witnessed. Thompson had not remained silent because he was unable to respond or because he lacked conviction about his service. He had maintained his discipline because his commitment to duty transcended personal comfort, ego, or the need to justify himself to critics. Captain Sterling stepped forward with newfound respect for his subordinate's demonstration of character under extreme pressure. "Senator Mitchell, I believe Corporal Thompson has answered your question more eloquently than any words could express." Mitchell stood silent for several moments, processing what had occurred. His challenge had been designed to expose what he saw as the emptiness of ceremonial military tradition, but instead he had discovered something profound about the nature of service and sacrifice that transcended his narrow understanding of military effectiveness. "Corporal Thompson," Mitchell said quietly, his confrontational tone completely abandoned, "I owe you an apology." The senator's words created a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. No one had expected such a dramatic reversal from the man who had spent hours attacking Thompson's service and character. "I came here believing that ceremonial duty was meaningless pageantry," Mitchell continued, his voice carrying genuine remorse. I thought I could expose the hollowness of your traditions by breaking down your discipline. Instead, you've shown me something about courage that I had forgotten." Thompson remained at attention, but the single tear had been joined by others that he made no effort to hide. His emotional response was not weakness, but the natural reaction of someone whose deepest convictions had been tested and proven unshakable. Mitchell turned to address the crowd of observers, many of whom were now viewing him with a mixture of respect for his honesty and residual anger about his methods. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand corrected about the value of British military tradition. What I witnessed today was not empty ceremony, but a demonstration of character that would be valuable in any military situation." Lord Pemberton, who had endured hours of diplomatic stress while watching the confrontation unfold, found himself reassessing both men. "Senator Mitchell, while your methods were unconventional, the result has been rather remarkable." The senator approached Thompson one final time, but now with the respectful bearing of one soldier acknowledging another's excellence. "Son, you've taught me something important about the relationship between discipline and strength. Your service has meaning that goes far beyond what I initially understood." Mitchell then did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute to Corporal Thompson, a gesture of respect from one veteran to another that transcended nationality and rank. Thompson, still maintaining his ceremonial post, could not return the salute according to protocol, but his slight nod of acknowledgement was visible to all present. The exchange represented a moment of mutual recognition between two very different concepts of military service. The American delegation, which had watched their colleagues' behavior with growing embarrassment, now found themselves experiencing unexpected pride in Mitchell's ability to recognize and acknowledge his error. His willingness to apologize publicly and change his position based on new understanding showed a different kind of courage. As word of the extraordinary confrontation and its resolution spread throughout the castle, it became clear that both men had achieved something remarkable. Thompson had demonstrated that true discipline came from inner strength rather than external compulsion, while Mitchell had shown that genuine leadership required the humility to admit when one's assumptions were wrong. The 3-hour test of wills had become something neither man had anticipated, a profound lesson about the nature of service, the value of tradition, and the possibility of finding common ground between very different approaches to military honor. The aftermath of the confrontation between Senator Mitchell and Corporal Thompson created ripples that extended far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. Within hours, accounts of the extraordinary encounter were being shared throughout both the American diplomatic community and British military circles, with each retelling emphasizing different aspects of what had occurred. Queen Elizabeth II herself requested a detailed briefing about the incident after hearing reports from multiple sources within the castle. When informed about Thompson's dignified response to sustained provocation and Mitchell's eventual recognition of his error, Her Majesty expressed both pride in her guard's conduct and appreciation for the senator's ultimate humility. It appears, the Queen remarked to her private secretary, that both men discovered something valuable about themselves and each other through this rather unorthodox encounter. The immediate consequence for Thompson was a private meeting with Captain Sterling, who wanted to ensure that his subordinate had not suffered lasting effects from the extended psychological pressure. What he found was a soldier whose confidence in his service had been strengthened rather than weakened by the challenging experience. "Corporal Thompson, Captain Sterling, you demonstrated exceptional character under extremely difficult circumstances. How are you processing what occurred?" Thompson considered his answer carefully, as he did all things. "Sir, Senator Mitchell's questions forced me to examine why I serve and what my duty means to me. I discovered that my commitment goes deeper than I had previously understood." The captain nodded with satisfaction. "Your response to his challenge has brought honor to yourself, your unit, and the British military. I'm recommending you for recognition of your exceptional service under adverse conditions." Meanwhile, Senator Mitchell was experiencing his own period of reflection and consequence. His dramatic change of position regarding British ceremonial traditions had surprised his colleagues and required him to explain his actions to congressional leadership back in Washington. Senator Williams approached Mitchell that evening as he prepared his official report on the diplomatic visit. "Bob, what you did today took real courage. It's not easy to admit error so publicly, especially for someone in your position." Patricia Mitchell replied thoughtfully, "That young guard taught me something I thought I already knew about military service. Real strength isn't always about fighting back or asserting yourself. Sometimes it's about maintaining your principles when everything around you is challenging them." The senator's report to Congress included an unprecedented section praising British military discipline and recommending increased cooperation between American and British forces. His description of Thompson's conduct under pressure became required, reading at several military academies as an example of composure under psychological stress. 6 months later, Mitchell returned to Britain for follow-up meetings on NATO coordination. He specifically requested permission to visit Windsor Castle again. Wanting to thank Thompson personally and to see how the young guard was progressing in his career, Thompson, who had been promoted to Lance Corporal partly based on his demonstrated character during the senator's visit, was assigned to escort duties when Mitchell returned. The reunion between the two men was warm and respectful, marked by mutual appreciation for what they had learned from their first encounter. "Lance Corporal Thompson," Mitchell said during a private moment in their meeting, "I want you to know that your example has influenced how I approach challenges in my own work. It showed me that sometimes the strongest response is quiet dignity rather than aggressive confrontation." Senator Thompson replied, "Your questions help me understand my service more deeply than years of routine duty had accomplished. Sometimes we need someone to challenge our assumptions so we can discover what we truly believe." Their conversation was overheard by several junior guards, who were curious about the famous confrontation they had heard described many times. The story had become part of the unit's folklore, serving as an example of how to maintain professional standards even under unprecedented pressure. The incident also influenced training procedures at the Royal Military Academy, where new officers learned about the importance of supporting subordinates who faced unusual challenges while maintaining appropriate discipline and protocol. Thompson's experience became a case study in leadership and character development. Mitchell's political career continued for another 15 years, but he was forever changed by his encounter with the British Guard. He became known for his willingness to listen to opposing viewpoints and his ability to acknowledge when his initial assumptions were incorrect. Colleagues noted that he often referred to a lesson I learned from a young soldier in England when explaining his approach to difficult negotiations. Thompson eventually achieved the rank of sergeant major and spent several years training new guards, always emphasizing that ceremonial duty required not just physical discipline but mental strength and emotional resilience. He would tell his trainees, "You never know when your service will be tested in ways you don't expect. Your response in those moments defines not just your own character, but the reputation of everyone who has worn this uniform." The story of their confrontation became legendary within both American and British military circles, serving as an example of how seemingly adversarial encounters could lead to mutual respect and understanding. It demonstrated that true strength could be found in maintaining principles under pressure, while genuine leadership required the humility to recognize and acknowledge excellence regardless of its source. Years later, when military historians wrote about Anglo-American relations during the 1960s, they often cited the Mitchell-Thompson incident as a perfect example of how cultural differences could be bridged through individual courage and mutual respect. The confrontation that had begun as a test of patience had evolved into a lasting testament to the universal values that unite professional soldiers, regardless of their nationality or assignment. Their story served as a reminder that heroism came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through conflict, but through the quiet demonstration of unshakable character in the face of sustained challenge.